Welcome to URise, Undergraduates Rising in Support in the Environment. I'm Nina.
And I'm Maddie.
And today we're going to be discussing climate change deniers and the arguments commonly used by deniers, and then also the tactics behind big corporations to try and perpetuate these myths and half-truths about climate change.
For our first segment, we're going to talk about climate change by the numbers. And our number today is 97%. And recent studies have shown that 97% of climate change researchers agree that climate change is human caused. And this was found by the Consensus Project. We see in the media that that is not the percentage that's represented. We often see a 50-50 split of one person who believes in climate change and one person who disagrees, and they're having sort of a shouting match or some sort of very aggressive conversation about climate change. And I think it's important to acknowledge that that is not representative of scientists' beliefs, that is not representative of the public's belief, and instead we should be able to have those conversations in a productive manner, but also acknowledge that 97% of scientists are on the side of climate change.
And that's in this episode, we're also going to be talking about how to have a conversation with someone who's a climate change denier and actually how to facilitate a discussion with them, because we want to move away from having those screaming matches where everyone's like represented equally when it's maybe not the case, and we want to move towards a more neutral platform where everyone can discuss their viewpoints and their opinions and be able to voice them in a constructive manner so that we can actually get work done for climate change, and so that we can leave a discussion feeling productive as opposed to just pushing people down or making them feel uneducated or making them feel unwelcome. We want to create a much better discourse surrounding most discussions, but in particular climate change.
Yeah, and I really believe that part of your job as a climate activist, or even just somebody who believes in climate change, is to be able to have those conversations in a productive manner, in a calm manner, and also be able to hear other people's arguments. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today, is the common arguments made by deniers and how to have a conversation about those and dispute what they're talking about. And one of those first arguments really is climate versus weather. When people talk about day-to-day weather patterns as if they're representative of the entire climate. One example of this is James Inhofe, the chair of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and when he brought a snowball into the Senate and tried to convince the Senate that that example of snow represented why climate change wasn't real. Because if snow can exist, obviously global warming can't. But what we need to understand is that climate isn't weather. Climate is what a lot of climate change researchers and activists will say is that climate is your closet and weather is just what you wear on a single day. So you might live where we live in the Northeast, and in the summertime I wear shorts, but my closet still has winter coats and a very wide array to represent like the climate that I live in and my environment year round. So being able to have that conversation, I think, is really important, and bring up these kind of blasphemous events where educated people in our political system come in and bring these weather arguments and be able to dispute that.
Being conscious of those arguments is really important because it'll help people to understand the distinction between what people are trying to portray and the actual science behind it. This is also important in the next argument that is commonly brought up, which is climate change isn't new. It's been happening for thousands of years. And this is true. Our global climate has been fluctuating for thousands of years just across the entire timeline of the planet. But what is different is that's not what climate change is now. That is just a change in climate. Climate change now, which used to be called global warming, if people remember, it refers to a very specific about, 100, 200 year time period, starting with the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, where we started burning lots of coal and we started having a lot of industrial processes generating a lot of waste. Around that same time, there was a huge uptick in our temperature where we started getting warmer years and warmer years and warmer years. This is commonly referred to as the hockey stick graph. It kind of looks like a hockey stick because it's nice and level and then peaks at the end, and we're in that end peak point. And this is what people refer to as climate change. It's not the whole graph. So that's a common misconception that, we're not looking at the whole scale. We're just looking at this one specific sudden uptick that deviates sharply from what the rest of the graph has shown. And that's this problem that people don't understand, that while the graph has fluctuated in the past, we're really focusing on the very sudden, sharp uptick that has been a result of humans burning coal and other fossil fuels.
Even though they might believe in climate change, they might say climate change is happening, but it's too expensive. I think what's really important to understand about that argument is what climate change activists and climate change legislation is pushing for is making an investment right now to prevent future losses. If we can make investments into greener energy and greener business now, then we won't have to have the massive economic loss as a result of the effects of climate change. And this has to do with things like increasing storm surges and sea level rise. Most of the US population lives on the coastlines, and that's true in a lot of places. So when we see a massive migration of people in the US away from coastlines as a result of the influx of water from sea level rise, we will see a massive economic loss of those homes and businesses on the coastlines.
Tying into that with the large movements of people from the coastlines is when people make the argument that climate change is happening, but it's not bad. That is to say, people say that climate change is almost good because it's making warmer weather and like nicer seasons because it's warm all the time. And while this may be nice to feel, that's not what the only effect of climate change is. It's not just warmer weather. It's stronger storms, the higher sea levels that will cause the movement of people inwards from the coast, higher winds, and just destruction of homes along those coastlines, and changing the world as we know it. So there could be larger damages, such as like damages to agriculture and crops and things like that. That all come from climate change. So we have to remember in this case that climate change isn't just one thing of it's getting warmer, but it's a whole other slew of issues that tie into what climate change is as a whole.
Yeah, so when we talk about these arguments made by deniers, we're also talking about arguments made by big corporations and the influence that these corporations have on our government, on our media, and then on public opinion as well. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how these corporations or climate change deniers appeal to others using and what tactics they use. And one big tactic is they have independent research funded by these climate change deniers and and big corporations, fossil fuel corporations, and other corporations that have a big stake in arguing against climate change. And this includes organizations like the Cato Institute and the Heartland Institute that are pumping out research that looks reputable and it can be reputable, but oftentimes is very biased. And so people go and they do research on climate change independently on their own as an individual, and they will find these companies and think tanks with fancy names and reputable research or seemingly reputable research, and they will pull people onto their side and find people in that gray area who may not believe in climate change or may believe in climate change or somewhere on that spectrum, and be able to pull them away from a climate change belief.